So this is my supervisor in the GSP programs, Dr. Diane, the sweetest person I've ever met.
I don't think it's switched on.
And really helpful. The mic is on, you can turn. So I'll hand over the mic to her, and happy listening.
Can you hear me? No. Okay.
Yes, we can hear you.
Oh, you can hear us, but I don't think we can hear ourselves.
There is sound, but it's quite low. I think.
Can you try this one? Try this one.
Okay, how about now?
Yeah,
Can people in this room hear me?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, we can hear you. Yes.
Okay, you can hear me too?
Yes.
Yes, fantastic.
Yes.
Okay, thank you so much. It is such an honor to be here. I'm delighted to be invited through the EJSP program to KSU today and to be here finally. It's taken me 2 years, and I've been enjoying my supervision experience so far. So thank you so much, and it's delightful to be presenting at this conference today. So yes, my talk today is on a relative pronoun that you might not find in the dictionary, called that's. So we're going to start with some questions about language change and the drivers for language change. So most people who study diachrony and how language evolution, in inverted commas, note that language change is often linked to variation. So variance can drive language change, and can be linked, and is also seen to be linked with acquisition, right? So there's pressures on speakers. There's some evolutionary pressures on speakers and languages. For speakers, it's easier for speakers to acquire grammars that have regular, predictable, systematic, morphological paradigms, right? It's just easier for acquisition. That doesn't mean that all languages have regular, simple morphological paradigms. So there's many examples of languages with irregularity of paradigms. But from an evolutionary and acquisition standpoint, it's just easier for speakers to acquire predictable paradigms. So this is why we get children producing forms, over-regularizing and over-generalizing forms during acquisition. Having said that, yes, it's still the case that for various reasons, usually kind of historical accident, paradigms still can be defective. So inflectional paradigms throw up these funny cases, and I'm looking for examples in Arabic, and you can probably tell me one by the end of the talk, where there's a gap in the paradigm, right? So we have lots of examples. In French, the verb frire, to fry, and close to close. They don't have an imperfect past tense form, so you can form other tenses, but not the imparfait with those verbs. The Russian verb to dream doesn't have a genitive plural form. It has other forms. The noun to dream. Spanish, abolir, to abolish, has no first-person singular form in the paradigm. It just doesn't exist. So you can't say, I abolish something in Spanish, but we'll talk more about the verb a bit later. And in English, we have verbs like to abide by. So you can say I abide by something, or she abides by something, but there's no past tense form that sounds good. So you can't really say she abided by or she abode by. That just doesn't sound right. So these are paradigm gaps, right? These are places where an inflectional form that you expect to exist just kind of doesn't exist for some reason. So paradigm gaps usually apply to individual lexemes, right? So it's an idiosyncratic fact about a word that it contains a gap in its paradigm, not to entire categories. And it turns out, so research on paradigm gaps has found that speakers can still produce these impossible forms just because they need to produce something, right? When the intention is there, they need to produce something in that paradigm, and they do come out with the so-called unacceptable forms, and often with sort of gradient acceptability. So different speakers feel better or worse about these apparently impossible forms. So filling paradigm gaps involves gradients, basically. So so just to give an example of another paradigm gap, so in English, we have a paradigm gap for the second person plural pronoun, which, as anyone who tries to speak English knows, you want to address multiple people, and many languages have some kind of plural second person pronoun or a formal second person pronoun, and we just don't. So we have you and we have you. But in colloquial English varieties, we actually have grammaticalized many forms of the second person plural. So in my dialect of English, when we want to address multiple addressees, we use you guys. And that's not slangy or colloquial, that's just how you say second person plural. In the southern parts of the US, it's y'all. So again, people will say, y'all come and visit soon. And it sounds strange to me, but in the South, that's just how you say the second person. We also find forms like use and use guys in Brooklyn and so on. So yeah, speakers will come up with ways to fill paradigm gaps. So the focus of this talk is going to be on English relative clauses, where we also will find that there is a paradigm gap. So if you think, so in English, when we form relative clauses, both subject and object relative clauses, we have a choice of relative pronouns. So we have who and we have that. And if you look at the distribution of who and that, and we also have which. I'm not going to talk so much about which, I'll mention it later. But if you look at the distribution of who and that, we find an interesting pattern. So we get the woman who tap danced, so that's a subject relative clause, that sounds fine. We can also use the woman that tap danced, pretty much interchangeably. We can say the pencil that broke, that's fine. But the pencil who broke doesn't sound so good. So the variation, or the contrast between that and who is related to animacy, right? So speakers feel that can be used with lexical items or heads of relative clauses of kind of any animacy, but who seems to be restricted to animates. So what do we mean by animacy? So we find, linguists who study animacy, it's become an obsession of mine. I love animacy. So it turns out that animacy is not a clear-cut binary contrast between animate nouns and inanimate nouns. It's much more subtle and complicated than that. So what we find is that animacy actually forms a scale, or a hierarchy with gradients in between the hierarchy. So we have humans. So if you look at across all languages, they incorporate animacy in some ways into their grammatical systems. Humans we find at the highest end of the hierarchy. So humans. So again, sort of humans are like us. They're very much, they resemble the speaker or resemble the language user, other humans. And then as you go down the animacy hierarchy, down the conceptual scale, we come to entities that are less and less like us. So we have animals, or sort of larger, familiar animals. We have horses and cats and dogs. And then through to smaller animals, we've got our hamsters, our gerbils, our grasshoppers. And then we get into bacteria, and then we get into non-living but concrete objects. So we have our rocks and our trees, and we have trees, right? So they're living, but not animals, right? Not mobile. And then we have our rocks, and then we have our lumps of gold, and so on. And then we have our abstract concepts, right? So they are the kind of least animate things we can imagine. They are the things least like humans. And they form a scale. Now, of course, when we actually conceptualize the world, we have this hierarchy or this scale in our sort of built into our human cognition. It seems to be a basic fact of human cognition that we see the world this way. But of course, it's more complicated than that. So we can personify inanimate objects. So the first picture up here is from the film Toy Story, right? So, and this is a story about, it's a film about toys who kind of come to life and they talk and they do things, but they act like people. So we sort of personify, the makers of the film sort of personify the toys. And in that world of the film, those inanimate objects take on the properties of humans, right? We also have a talking telephone here, right? So he's another character in the film. So he's also been sort of personified in this film. So we can use our kind of metaphorical extension, or we can personify things. We can also, and this works all the way down the scale. So in the last So we can even stick some googly eyes on potatoes, and they look real. They look alive. They look more like humans once we stick some eyes on them. So in terms of human cognition, there seem to be certain cues we look for that make things more or less like us. So if we stick eyes on something, it just automatically makes it look more human. Right, I digress. So animacy is a scale, it's a slippery slope, and it really depends on how you conceptualize things in the world. But for our purposes today, it's a very important notion for human grammars. So this is one of these interesting interfaces between human cognition and the way our grammars are designed. And what we find is many different effects in many different languages where animacy conditions grammatical phenomena, but often not in a simple binary way, but with kind of gradient effects. So again, it kind of depends on how you're conceptualizing the world, and that will plug into your grammatical system, and that will have you using a particular form. So yeah, in English, for example, we find the contrast between the so-called Latin genitive sort of the house, or for possession, the back of the house, versus the Anglo-Saxon apostrophe S possession, Mary's back. So this is conditioned by animacy to a certain extent. So the back of Mary doesn't quite sound right, and the house's back doesn't quite sound right. Right, so the choice of that seems to be linked to animacy. In Arabic, I just supervised a PhD on this. So if you have a subject-noun phrase in Arabic, for example, if you have a masculine plural but inanimate subject, you often find third-person singular feminine agreement on the verb, right? And again, this is sort of conceptual scale. So you sometimes find so the verbal agreement kind of tells you how you're conceptualizing the subject-noun phrase. If you're conceptualizing it as more human, it will appear as plural agreement, but if it's less human, it's probably going to be singular. So you have that interesting effect in Arabic with agreement. In Russian, yeah, just a few more examples. So there's separate accusative case forms for inanimates and animates. In a language that I've been looking at called Laz, which is related to Georgian, that's spoken in Turkey, they have two different verbs to be, depending on whether the possessor the possessee, is animate or inanimate. And then you get these spectacular grammaticalized animacy hierarchies, like in Navajo and some related languages. So in Navajo, basic word order in a transitive sentence is conditioned by animacy. It's constrained by animacy. So in Navajo, the first noun phrase of the sentence needs to be higher on the animacy scale than the object of the sentence. So the subject needs to be higher than the object in a simple transitive sentence. So in Navajo, you can see the human. You can say something like, "The boy saw the squirrel," but you just can't say the squirrel saw the boy. It's not grammatical. You have to passivize it, and you have to say the boy was seen by the squirrel, basically. So the subject has to be higher than the object in the animacy hierarchy. So back to English relative clauses now. We find much less cool and spectacular animacy effects, but still interesting. So we'll go back to subject relative clauses and then come back to this who and that phenomenon. So if you look at the choice between who and that, again, you find these animacy effects. So the cat that scratched me is okay. So with humans, who always sounds okay, the choice of who in relative clauses. But then we find these sort of gradient effects depending on the animacy of the head noun. So the cat that scratched me is fine. The cat who scratched me is acceptable for many speakers of English, because we tend to kind of personify cats. Like they're familiar, they're our pets, and so on. But if you try the bacteria that infected me sounds okay, but the bacteria who infected me really doesn't sound good at all, because we can't really personify the bacteria. The tree that shaded the house sounds fine, but the tree who shaded the house really sounds pretty bad. Okay? So again, depending on how we conceptualize the world, that guides our use of the relative pronoun in English. If we try the same for object relative clauses, where the gap that's left behind by the relative pronoun originates as an object, we find exactly the same. So we get the woman who the crowd loved sounds fine. The woman that the crowd loved sounds fine. The house that the council built sounds fine, but the house who the council built just sounds weird. That really doesn't sound good. Because the house, the head noun, is inanimate and really can't occur with the pronoun who. So we find, to sum up, we find who is always great for humans, less good but still acceptable for animals usually, and just out for inanimate nouns, head nouns in relative clauses. Now we come to possessive relative clauses, and this is where things get interesting. So we have the possessive, so when you were studying English, if English is not your native language, you probably learned that whose is the relative, the possessive relative pronoun in English, the genitive relative pronoun. So you can say the woman whose hat fell off, and that sounds fine. Now, yeah, you do get people, speakers producing things like the sheep whose hoof is injured. That sounds, again, larger animals tend to sound okay with whose, cats, dogs, sheep, horses. But then when we get into a real inanimate noun, the tree whose bark is black just doesn't sound good. The house whose roof needs fixing also just doesn't sound good. Now we can use, you might read that you can paraphrase with of which, but then we get these horrible, awkward expressions like the tree, the bark of which is black. No one says that. That just sounds terrible. So yeah, so the of which paraphrase is really awkward. So again, whose sounds fine for humans. It sounds okay for animal head nouns, but for inanimates, we really can't use whose. So what do we use for? Yeah, so here's our paradigm. So in subject and object relative clauses, we can use, if the head noun is animate, we can use either that or who. If the head noun is inanimate, we can use that or sometimes which, depending. But with possessive relative clauses, we can use whose when the head noun is animate, but we don't really have anything to use when the head noun is inanimate, right? We just don't have another pronoun. If we had another pronoun, it might sound something, yeah. So, okay, well, let's look at that. Oh no, we've lost my slides. Oh, they're back, good, okay. So, yeah, so if you look at the diachronic reasons why there's no inanimate possessive relative pronoun in English, it goes back to Middle English, as usual, where all of our trouble started. So in the relative pronoun across the board in Old English was that, nice and simple. But in Middle English, we got invaded by some French people, and they had this whole complex set of relative pronouns. So we got who and which in Middle English, and whose was used for the possessive form of which. And whose was used for both inanimates and animates until the 18th century. And then the 18th century was when prescriptivist grammarians took over English. And this guy named Robert Louth published a book telling us all what we were supposed to say and what was fine and elegant grammar. And basically, if it was like Latin, we should say it. And if it wasn't like Latin, we shouldn't say it. But anyway, Robert Louth suggested that whose should not be used for inanimates, probably because it sounds like who, and who is not used for inanimates with other types of relative clauses. So that's where the suggestion first came from, that we can't use whose for inanimates. So instead, if you look at prescriptive guidelines of English, you're told to paraphrase with which, of which I told you sounds terrible, so the tree, the bark of which is black, doesn't sound good. So instead, what many speakers do is they use whose for inanimates. So you do get people saying things like the tree whose bark is black. I think I was told in school that that's what I should use, just whose for inanimates. We find examples from Dickens. So in David Copperfield, we get the venerable cathedral towers and the old jackdaws and rooks, whose airy voices make them more retired than perfect silence would have done. So in that case, the head noun is jackdaws and rooks, which are types of birds. Again, not the big animals, but the small kind. Pretty low in the animacy hierarchy. And then we find real inanimates head nouns as well with whose. The Micawber family were lodged in a little dirty, tumble-down public house, which in those days was close to the stairs, and whose protruding wooden rooms overhung the river. So in that case, the head noun is the little dirty, tumble-down public house, but whose is acceptable to Dickens as a possessive relative pronoun. So yeah, so some speakers are okay with whose, but others just feel like there's a gap in the paradigm. For these reasons, like first of all, the of which paraphrase is pretty awkward, and also for sort of straightforward semantic reasons. So the semanticist Larry Horn noticed, so he pointed out that if he asked whose leg was broken, an acceptable answer is Ken's, like a person, but not the dining room tables. So again, we still find, so if we use whose in a question, the default answer is a human, not an inanimate noun. So there's still a gap in the paradigm. Enter that's. Okay, so what we would expect to find, by analogy with whose in the possessive form, is something like that's. So we actually find a word that's in Scots. Okay, so Scots is a different dialect, or some would say language, spoken in Scotland. And it's quite frequent there. It's been observed to be quite frequent in Scots. It's quite recent, so there's no written examples before about the mid-17th century. And we find that's, just like that in other relative clauses, used for all levels of animacy. So we find, so this is from a Scots corpus, the woman that's sister married the postie, that's married the postman in standard English. And we find examples like the house that's roof was damaged. So this word that, I've spelled it in this talk without an apostrophe S, but as we'll see, English speakers, when they use it, they sometimes put in the apostrophe. The point is, it doesn't exist in the dictionary. You will not find this word in any prescriptive grammars of English. You'll not find it in a dictionary. It's a word that officially doesn't exist in English. But it's a way, just like we've said, it's a way of filling a paradigm gap. It's one of these forms that just doesn't technically exist in the paradigm. So the reason this paper is being given in the first place is because I started noticing, so I would have used whose for inanimates, inanimate head nouns, but when I was marking student essays in the UK, I started noticing my students using this word. So I first spotted it in a psycholinguistics exam, or maybe it was a first year exam. It pinpoints an area of the brain that's development could cause a critical period-like event to occur. A critical period-like event is so first year, I love it. Anyway, but yeah, so this student has put in that's just to fill that paradigm, like just has an inanimate head noun and has used that's. And then I started looking around and found, friends of a friend's Facebook pages. Another example, the second one would take something like this, that's end messages for us to create a world of acceptance and understanding. And then I started reading, there's been a few blogs about this phenomenon as well. So a spoofy fantasy adventure that's focus would be on a gorgeous blonde, whatever. So yeah, it turns out does actually appear quite frequently. When I've asked my undergraduate students in the UK about sentences like this, they say, oh, what other word would I use? Of course, that's how you'd say that. So it's never occurred to them not to use the word that's. So it seems to be something that's very frequently occurring in the speech of young British English speakers, but for older speakers like me and Americans like me, it just sounds really strange. So on the literature on that's in Scots, the origin of the form, it comes from, or one theory about where it comes from is that it comes from a that plus possessive construction in Scots. So something like the dog that its leg was run over, and that it's was contracted to that's. But you can also see there's a sort of phonological regularity here, right, with that, whose, that's, right? So it's also possible that this form just arose by analogy with whose, right? It just sounds similar. So we don't really know what the origin of the form was. Right, so going back to our paradigm, we have our subject and object relative pronoun. Again, we've got that for all head nouns, who for only animates. For possessive relative clauses, we have whose for animate head nouns, and for some speakers at least, we find that's filling the gap in the paradigm. So, right, so I thought this would be a kind of, So going back to the literature on paradigm gaps and how they get filled. So it turns out that filling paradigm gaps often involves, as I mentioned before, gradient judgments by speakers. So some speakers are happy with these filled paradigm gap forms, and some speakers are not so happy with them. You find a wide range of acceptability judgments when you ask speakers about them. So this is an observation about the verb abole. So this is the verb in Spanish that doesn't have a first person singular form. So another possible pitfall when looking only at the dictionary description of paradigm gaps is that we have no guarantee that speakers actually dislike the forms that prescriptive sources say to avoid. A Google search for the form abole turns up a small but non-negligible number of bona fide hits, and one online grammar resource notes that, despite this rule, however, supposedly unacceptable conjugations are used in real life. A recent news story stated that El Presidente my terrible Spanish, I think it means Ukrainian, ha promulgado una ley que abole la pena de muerte, which is a form that's not supposed to exist, but this appeared in print form recently in a newspaper. So why do speakers, or how do speakers deal with paradigm gaps? So going back again to the literature on language change, so we mentioned earlier that work on language change and language sort of evolutionary development has found that there is pressure on children, especially on young people when they're acquiring language, to acquire compressible grammars, which are predictable and economical and have regular paradigms. So it's just, again, it's easier for young acquirers of a language to learn regular paradigms. At the same time, they might be exposed to pressure from prescriptive norms, right? They might be being told in school, no, you can't say that. You should avoid that expression, even though that seems to be the regular form, or the most economical form, according to the paradigm. There's also been some really interesting work looking at how formal education can shape our native speaker intuitions about a language. I mean, this gets really interesting when you look at modern standard Arabic, for example, which technically has no native speakers, but many users of MSA feel some intuitions about what sounds right, but that's basically come through formal education, right? So you can't have intuitions that are shaped by formal education. Yes, but again, the literature from Paradigm Gap suggests that when speakers start to fill paradigms, you get gradient judgments. You get some speakers who like it and some speakers who don't, or some speakers feel like it's okay but not great. And there's other factors, of course, that condition the filling of paradigm gaps. So phonology, so if something sounds phonologically regular, that makes it sort of fit better into the paradigm. Semantics can condition paradigm shifts and also, paradigm gaps. And also frequency, of course. So a higher frequency form, a higher frequency form will have more pressure to regularize than a low frequency form. So if you don't say something very often, it doesn't really matter if it's irregular. But if you say something a lot, there's pressure on you to regularize it. So a student of mine and I did a research project looking into that's, and these are the questions we were going to try to answer. So we wanted to know, are my intuitions as a lecturer correct that possessive that's is on the increase? So do young people use this more than the older generation? And if so, is there a difference in varieties of English? Is this happening more in the UK? Or just as much in the United States, and which parts of the UK? What about Australia and Canada? To what extent is animacy a conditioning factor? So we kind of expect to turn up with low animacy nouns. Is that true? And are there any effects of formal education? So we actually did a survey. So we did a judgment task, but we also asked people a qualitative question in the survey. We asked them how much formal grammar education did you have? So how much were you exposed to? Because this varies a lot with different countries. Some English-speaking countries have a lot of formal grammar built into the curriculum. Some of them don't have so much. So we wanted to know how much formal grammar training did they get. So our predictions are that we expect the younger participants to accept that and think it sounds better. more than the older ones. We expect some UK varieties to accept that's more than US and other varieties. In particular, we expect people from Scotland to really like that's in all forms, but maybe not other English speakers. So if formal education and exposure to prescriptive grammar can affect our intuitions as L1 speakers, then we expect that higher levels of education should correlate with lower ratings for that's, right? So again, there's this prescriptive element for using that's. Teachers will be telling their students not to use it if they produce it. So we expect that the more educated the participant, the less they will accept that's. We also find just randomly through this variable in there, some sociolinguistic variables do correlate with gender, so we kept track of gender in case there was any difference, but we didn't really expect to find anything. Right, so we did this with an online survey, which has its own pluses and minuses. So we did this by social media and by email. We asked participants their age, their gender, their region, their education level, their extent to which they had formal grammar education. And because this was online, and my student and I posted it on social media, we got a whopping 289 respondents. So most of the projects that I've supervised with other kinds of questionnaire studies and so on, you're lucky if you get 25 or 30 participants. But this is 289. It's a lot of people, which is great. We got lots of data. We could do statistics on the data. But of course, it's kind of unsupervised. So when you're not standing over somebody's shoulder when they're doing an online survey, you can't clarify any points or answer any questions to people doing the survey. So there's upsides and downsides with online surveys. Also, we're dealing with a form that's never written down, so or that isn't normally written down. So we're presenting this word to speakers of English, and they're not used to seeing it in print. So we also don't know how that might affect how they respond to the task. So as we've seen, when paradigm gaps get filled by speakers, this often results in gradient judgments, so varieties or variations on how acceptable the form sounds to speakers. So instead of just asking speakers, does this sound good, does this sound bad, we gave them a Likert scale to try to capture these nuances. Now, Likert scales aren't perfect, and if you look at these categories, they're still not perfect, but they were a kind of useful working way to evaluate acceptability. So we asked speakers to rate sentences on a scale from 1, so something like, this sounds bad, I've never heard this, I would never say it, up to good, this sounds good, I would say it. And in the middle are things like, yeah, this sounds okay, I've heard others say it, but I might avoid using it myself, something like that. So people, if you're just kind of wishy-washy about an acceptability judgment, they can mark down 3. We then had an animacy variable, so we had 3 levels of animacy. We used inanimate concrete objects like phone, so we had sentences like, there's a phone that screen is cracked. I used that sentence because I found myself producing it after making this big production about this word doesn't exist. A few weeks later, I caught myself saying the sentence, so there you go. So that went into the survey. So versus condition 2, so there's the phone whose screen is cracked, so that's an inanimate head noun with whose. And then we had animals, or large animals in the middle. So we had, there's the dog that's leg is broken, there's the dog whose leg is broken. And then we had humans. So there's the woman that's hair is dyed, there's the woman whose hair is dyed. We also gave them a bunch of fillers, including other forms of who and other forms of that's, because there's so many word that's in English that have so many functions. So, so here's the results. So we found that across all speakers, for inanimates, that's was preferred. So across the board, everyone was just happier with that's when the head noun was animate. So, so you can see in that first column there, although it doesn't look like a massive difference between the blue bar and the red bar for the inanimate head nouns, that's actually a very significant difference because the data set was so big. So yes, overall, people are happier with that's. for inanimate head nouns. For animals and humans, on the other hand, we find high levels of acceptability with whose. So whose sounds fine with animals, and this is completely will make sense for a study in the UK. It's a nation of animal lovers. They really like animals in the UK, so that wasn't surprising. They do a lot of, especially cats and dogs. They like their pets. So yes, lots of personification of animals and high levels of acceptability of whose. But you can see a substantial number of speakers across all forms accepted that's, right? So, okay. Yes, so of course this is the rating. So 5 is the highest rating and 0 is the middle. And you can see that's actually, the blue bar kind of hovers around the middle, right? 2.5. So, so a lot of people are kind of okay with that. When the head noun is animacy, so then we looked at how age correlated with that. So we ran an ANOVA for this, and we found that an effective age when the head noun was inanimate. So if you look at sentence A, here's the phone that screen is cracked. So we found an effective age, which means that the younger the speaker, the more they like this kind of sentence. We found a negative effective age for the second sentence. So here's the phone whose screen is cracked. The younger the speaker, the less they liked that sentence. So that's kind of what we expected to find. When the head noun was an animal, we also found an effective age. So there's the dog that's leg is broken. So again, the younger the speaker, the more they like that, and that was a significant effect. But no effect when the head noun, so with whose, right? So basically all speakers of all ages, doesn't matter how old you are, was happy with whose when the head noun was an animal, like there's the dog whose leg is broken. And when the head noun is a human, yes, so when the head noun is a human, we find an effective age for that's. So there's the woman that's hair is dyed. The younger the speaker, the happier they are with that sentence. So again, younger speakers just accept that's more across the board. And no effective age for there's the woman whose hair is dyed. So everybody likes that kind of sentence no matter what their age. So that's what we would expect. So then we were interested in looking at that's by region to see if there was an effective region. So that we found for the British respondents, the vast majority of so 289 respondents, but 233 came from the UK. So there were higher scores for all sentences with that's. So across the board, British speakers preferred that's compared to the other regions. So if you look at the American group, so they generally had lower scores for all sentences with that's. Interestingly, the Scots, there was no effect. So they didn't like them or dislike sentences with that's any more than anybody else. That was interesting. But of course, Scots live all over the UK, so maybe some of them were kind of mixed in. Although we did ask them in the survey, where did you grow up? In Yorkshire, so we found lower scores on condition 2 only, so whose plus inanimates. Again, so younger speakers, so speakers in general don't like those sentences. And then in Australia and New Zealand, we found a few effects. So higher scores, so Australians and New Zealanders preferred condition 5, so that's with humans, but lower scores for condition 6, who's for humans. So that was kind of interesting as well. But there was only 13 respondents, so not great power for that kind of test. Then we looked at the other variables because we had all these interesting questions about the role of education and so on. And we found no effect of educational attainment. So it didn't matter if you'd been to secondary school, university, PhD, everybody had the same ideas about that. This suggests that fine-grained level of prescriptive grammar, it just doesn't really happen in English-speaking schools anymore. So it's something that you might have found 60 or 70 years ago, but schools just don't bother with that level of prescriptive grammar anymore. Also, no effect of explicit grammar instruction. So those who said, yes, I did have some explicit grammar instruction, that didn't make any difference to their opinions about that. And yes, not surprisingly, no effect of gender, so we didn't expect it to be an interesting variable, and it wasn't. So yeah, so just what do these data mean? So this suggests, so we can use, because there's a strong correlation of age, so younger people across the board like that's better than older people. We can tentatively conclude that there's something like language change going on, so we can use this as an apparent time study. Obviously, you would have to do a longitudinal study, but that could take a while to really confirm that. But it does look like under this pressure for a regular, predictable, systematic paradigm that we read about, it looks like speakers of English are filling that defective paradigm and filling that gap with the form that's. And that animacy is a driver. So we saw that semantics can affect the filling of paradigm gaps, and it looks like animacy here is an important conditioning factor. We need to have a pronoun for inanimate things, and we need to use that's. So that there's a semantic need to fill that spot in the paradigm. Yes, and we found, as we suspected, this seems to be a larger pattern in the U.S. than in the UK than the US, although I do keep hearing Americans producing this form, so it might just be a problem with the sample. Yes, also interesting, so no effective education or explicit grammar instruction, so it looks like exposure to prescriptive guidelines and standard written forms does not seem to affect intuitions for this particular form. And no effective gender, like I mentioned before. But we do find, as predicted for the literature on filling paradigm gaps, we find gradients. So we find lots of judgments of these sentences that are kind of in the middle. People say, yeah, that sounds all right, maybe I wouldn't say it. And then other speakers who really like those forms, and some speakers who really don't like those forms. So that's what we expect to find, is gradients. So yeah, just to think about some methodological issues, if we could do this study all over again. So as I mentioned before, online surveys are unsupervised. We can't really see what people, maybe it's late at night and people are sitting there with the junk food and just tapping any old keys. We did have a few forms that were obviously, people not taking the survey seriously, and we can exclude those people as outliers. So most people did seem to take the survey seriously, but you never know. Sampling effects, like I said, we mostly got UK respondents. It would be really interesting to run this study again in Australia and Canada and the US and different regions of the US, South Africa, other English-speaking countries, and see what we find. Task effects, like I said, Likert scales, they're not perfect. That people might have judgments that don't exactly correlate with one of those numbers and might struggle to fill in which number they choose. That could affect the respondents a little bit. And also, it'd be really interesting to investigate the lower end of the animacy scale. So we just looked at large animals for the animal category, but it would be interesting to see what happens with smaller animals, for example. How do people feel about, squirrels and grasshoppers as a head noun? And also abstract noun phrases. So can we make any speculation about the future of that? So we have examples in English where we had paradigm gaps. So we had verbs that were irregular. They had gaps in the paradigm, or forms that didn't work very well, and now they've been regularized. So this happened with help and laugh and reach and walk and work. So there was this pressure to regularize on those verbs, and they did regularize. But then possessive relative clauses are not particularly frequent. In fact, I did look up a frequency study of relative clauses, and they're really infrequent compared to the other classes of relative clause. So there might be less pressure on this particular form to regularize than in other areas of the grammar. So it might just stay kind of hover in the middle where it is now, but the trend seems to show that there's a change in the direction of acceptability for this pronoun. So yes, thanks to my 2 students who helped me out on this project, and that's it. Hi. So I think Munira has a question.
Does she have a mic?
Oh, we need 2 working microphones, I think. Oh well.
Thank you very much, Diane. This is very interesting. Made me think about Arabic, actually. We have so many relative pronouns. الذي, اللذان, الذين, اللاتي. But unfortunately, we don't use them in the spoken form. So maybe it happened years ago. It's very interesting. Maybe we can see it's a neutralization. It happened in Arabic. Now we use illi for everything. There is no gender differences, number differences. Illi in most of our dialects, in our groups, Saudi or outside.